Michael Saylor versus Jack Dorsey on how the future of Bitcoin might look like.
It's really interesting that this almost theological debate is still happening, but the stakes are in the billions and trillions of dollars.
Seeing this come to a head when it comes to development is a big, big deal.
I think it's really important because you're essentially investing in the next generation of shepherds for the Bitcoin network.
He is absolutely selling the narrative. The narrative is everything. These are psychological commodities. Bitcoin is a psychological commodity.
Are people looking at him as another coming of some like a Satoshi level figure?
Permissionless, the crypto industry's leading developer conference, is coming to Brooklyn this June 24th to the 26th. And this time, Bitcoin is showing up in a big way. That's right, with confidence in Ethereum and Solana on the decline, interest in Bitcoin development is riding high. And yet the way forward for many builders remains unclear. Layer 2s, meta protocols, soft fork upgrades. We'll be talking about the future of Bitcoin and how and if it needs to change. Of course, tickets are going fast. You can get them today at blockworks.co. We'll see you there. This episode of Supply Shock is brought to you by Ledn, a proud Bitcoin-only company and the global leader in Bitcoin-backed lending. Need cash but don't want to sell down your Bitcoin stack? Ledn has a trusted track record in providing liquidity. That's Ledn. You'll hear more about them later in this episode. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research. A quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed. Hello and welcome to the Supply Shock podcast. I'm your host, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian on X. We've got a stacked lineup of special guests today. We've got Michael McSweeney, editor at Blockworks, and we've got Nolan Bauerle, Count BTC on X, and you know him from Bitcoin on Rumble. So we've got a little bit of a Rumble today. Today's episode focusing on Michael Saylor versus Jack Dorsey, two of the heavyweights at the forefront of Bitcoin adoption, but at odds a bit in their public projections of what makes Bitcoin so special. So I guess to dive in, we're going to focus this episode on looking at a number of aspects of each of these figures and how they relate to Bitcoin, their investments, their philosophy, their vision, who they're up against in their fight to achieve Bitcoin greatness, and finally some conclusions with our thoughts on how the future of Bitcoin might look like. First, I guess let's dive into the investment. So taking a look at Mr. Dorsey and Mr. Saylor and their respective investments in the Bitcoin and crypto space. Nolan, maybe you can kick us off and give the background, the 101 on Michael Saylor for those who are not in the know.
Well, Michael Saylor actually did a pretty interesting sort of untold story on the origins of his Bitcoin purchase. And it just happened on the Jordan Peterson podcast this week, where he got into, let's call it, the existential angst he saw during COVID, when he saw only Amazon delivery trucks, and then the seagulls had come from South Beach to eat the worms on his property because they weren't getting fed the food there. And he really had this end of fiat vibe. And when interest rates went down to zero, he said, well, I'm sitting on this cash and I'm just getting nuked into oblivion. What should I do? And he said, well, gold. And then he did the math on gold. And he's like, well, they find 2% a year. So there's an inflation rate. So in 12 years, your gold will be wiped out. And then he asked Eric, his colleague, and he said, tell me about this Bitcoin thing again. And his exercise was literally, if money existed in heaven and God created it, it would look a lot like Bitcoin. And from there, of course, he comes out with the strategy, literally the strategy, the name of his company now. It turned to MicroStrategy, with the biggest macro strategy in the world, which was to bet on the fiat apocalypse and transfer the incentives inside of the corporate treasury to what we now call the MicroStrategy play, or BTC, balance sheet micro Bitcoin treasury plays. So from there, MicroStrategy was a software company that worked on supply chain optimization, all kinds of little things, very unsexy business, and was one of these melting ice cubes, they're called. That's sort of the target language that people hear about when you think about what would make a good Bitcoin treasury company. So basically a company that's forced to do stock buybacks with its extra cash, not really incentivized to invest in the business. And so MicroStrategy was born out of a corporate treasury play in order to mitigate what is sometimes known by Bitcoiners as the fiat apocalypse, the end of fiat and its problems in the market. So that's where the whole MicroStrategy comes from. On the other end, of course, with Jack Dorsey, he started out with the Cash App play, which was a very interesting company because it targeted a lot of urban businesses, small businesses as a payments provider, really great technology. We've all used it. We all know what it looks like. They focused on yoga studios. They focused on cafes and things that maybe had some banking trouble and were paying too much of the credit card fees. From there, it turned into more than just an app, of course. We saw they went deeper into Bitcoin development stuff with Spiral. They created what we know now as Block, which is a combination of Cash App, Square, which is the tile you all recognize from the payment swiping. And they merged that into one of the best Bitcoin buying apps in the world. I'm a huge fan. They put in a really excellent primer in there, the Bitcoin book. They created a news feed, which was really exciting, focusing on Bitcoin news. And they don't confuse people. It's just Bitcoin buy, Bitcoin hold. They have a really great way of pulling the Bitcoin out of their wallet. And a really neat and tidy technology, something I recommend to people all the time. They went one step further in that Cash App or Block ended up getting a banking license in the state of Utah, and that's what we call a industry banking license, so industrial banking license, which is kind of in line with what we just heard about from the cafes and the yoga studios. This allows them to provide loans to certain businesses and to be essentially an all-in-one Bitcoin bank product. Both of them now, I think the Bitcoin holdings are about 8,000 Bitcoin over at Cash App that they've managed to stack on their thing. They had a big announcement the other day at Bitcoin 2025 in Las Vegas, which was the integration of that Lightning payments into all those Cash App terminals, probably the biggest deployment of Bitcoin for commercial reasons in the history of Bitcoin. So that's what I see in these two companies.
Well, I'll add a couple more facts on Jack Dorsey. First, kind of commenting on Bitcoin all the way back in 2011, so very early, has also made claims that he read the Bitcoin white paper on the cryptography mailing list. But Jack Dorsey surfacing a lot in the early years of Bitcoin in 2014, coming out and saying that Square would accept any form of payment, including Bitcoin. So prior to its work, kind of hinting and alluding to that future. In 2017, we saw him become a lot more vocal, as Nolan mentioned, Cash App kind of taking its first steps in integrating Bitcoin for commerce, movement that really picked up in 2019 and 2020 when Jack Dorsey became one of the first users of the Bitcoin Lightning Network. So turning on Bitcoin payments on a layer 2 and using that to move payments around the internet. And that was really, I think, when people think about Jack Dorsey and Bitcoin, the orange iridescent t-shirts, the long beards, becoming the Bitcoin wizard man who emerged from the wilderness, enlightened, saying that he wants Bitcoin to be the world currency and that he thinks it will bring world peace. So two very different flavors there, contrasting to Mr. Saylor. And I know, Michael, we were talking backstage a little bit about just the motifs and kind of the stylistic differences of these two friends and obviously fellow evangelists, but who have some different views on where they want to take the industry.
Yeah, I think if you were really to distill it, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say on the one side you have Dorsey, who looks at Bitcoin as a payments network. And I think if you look at the investments that he has made, all the activities through Block, it's investing in that network. There's mining, there's payments, there's development, with the hope of, as he has said, to make Bitcoin a payments, the currency of the world. How can this become more of like a native thing for people to use? And on the other hand, you have Michael Saylor, who, this is about how do you sort of create a bridge for Bitcoin to the world of Wall Street, where you tap this enormous, seemingly infinite well of liquidity that can then be piped back into Bitcoin. And obviously we see the price appreciation that it has experienced. So it's interesting that they're coming at it from very different angles, but I think ultimately the shared goal there is adoption and use. Now, the debate over, should Bitcoin be cash? Should it be a digital store of value? Should it fall somewhere in between? I mean, these are I mean, in Bitcoin scales, ancient debates, they remain unsettled. You can go back to Bitcoin talk and see people, arguing about this. So it's really interesting that this almost theological debate is still happening, but the stakes are in the billions and trillions of dollars. So again, I think they both want the same thing, but the way they're coming at it, and it's very interesting to be like an observer of all this. They're coming at it, I think, from very different angles.
Well, as far as being an observer, we had a real perch for this, because I remember in the early days of CoinDesk, when we were all there, CoinDesk was really like a tech magazine, right? It was about scaling. It was about what the cryptographers said, what the core dev said. It was really about the network and using
technology publication.
It was a technology publication. When the Wall Street thing happened and we started having to integrate markets stuff, we remember what the cryptographers and the developers were saying to us. It was like, what are you doing? This is not a markets thing. We said, well, what are we supposed to say? Here they are, right?
I mean, that's kind of the interesting thing about Bitcoin. It's I think I said this once, maybe got yelled at, but Bitcoin is a mirror, right? Like we bring our experiences and our biases and our preferences to it. And so you have Michael Saylor, someone who, they're built their career in the halls of Wall Street. So it's natural for them to like build a business and an investment vehicle that like comes at it from that vein. Whereas Jack Dorsey, he's that crypto punk, crypto cipher background, building up a well of investments and business ventures that come at Bitcoin from that angle.
They call it the hodler's dilemma. Ever wish you could get access to cash without selling down your stack? Well, Ledn makes that possible. Since 2018, Ledn has issued over $9 billion worth of Bitcoin-backed loans, and they haven't lost a single satoshi of client funds in the process. There are no credit checks. You can get funds in under 12 hours and repay whenever you want with zero penalties. Unlike others, Ledn doesn't lend out your collateral. They even publish biannual proof of reserves verified by top auditors in the blockchain. You can learn more at ledn.io. That's LEDN.io. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research. Let's get into the investments, the by the numbers approach. I'm going to start with the biggest contrasting element of both their investments, because again, in this phase of the podcast, we'll look at really where the money is going, right? And Jack Dorsey's money, he's got billions of dollars from both, Twitter as well as founding Square, which is now Block. He's putting a majority of that funding into Bitcoin core development. So we know from public research and studies that he's responsible for over 50% of the funding to different Bitcoin development groups. So this is, millions of dollars a year that are going directly from Jack Dorsey to the open source coders who are volunteering to work on Bitcoin's main software to find bugs, fix programming errors, and overall improve the network. Whereas Michael Saylor has famously declared that he won't make that investment, and there has been a number of public incidents where he has been, called to task for this opinion about how his money is going in the Bitcoin, the asset. Nolan, maybe let's start with you on this difference of funding between these two giants.
Yeah, it's a really important one too, because it really does show these two worldviews, right? With Jack Dorsey, indeed, we are talking about a network, a platform. We're talking about the developers all the time, trying to tweak it. We saw Ocean, for example, one of his investments in mining, focused on this debate recently about the filters, fix the filters. They don't like the JPEGs. They're anti-JPEG, no JPEGs, get them out of here. They determine what you're supposed to use it for. No, if it's just market stuff, no, right? We want it for what we want it for. So, and at the time, if you remember, indeed, Michael Saylor has been criticized regularly. But when this debate happened about a month and a half ago, everyone finally went, wait a minute, I kind of get what Michael Saylor is talking about here. Because from the gold world, we're talking about the Lindy effect. We're not talking about Silicon Valley. Bitcoin is antithetical to the fail fast and break things ethos of Silicon Valley. It's not consumer technology. This is not a race to ship. It's nothing like that, right? It is entirely based on the credibility of the network, and the credibility of the network takes risks when it goes around and tries to change and upgrade or whatever you want to call it. So Michael Saylor thinking of the network itself as gold in the sense that it is not an experiment. It's not a science experiment. It's not anyone's pet project, and he's certainly not going to fund what could ultimately cause problems in the market and uncertainty. So seeing this come to a head when it comes to development is a big, big deal. And having seen all of this stuff go around, like with the ocean, bragging about their reasons for filtering out transactions, but not so different than what we saw Mara do originally with the OFAC blocks. And remember the heat they got for that, because that was the one the developers didn't want you being prejudiced against, right? Or wanted you to be prejudiced against. So it was a weird situation where you've got this, motivation from the developers to do what they think is a priority versus the markets, which is just let it be and we'll see what happens. So I think it's a great case study in their contrasts. I thought it was great that we had that debate a couple of weeks ago about the filters and everything, because it really showed the merit of what Michael Saylor is saying and doing. And I thought that was sort of lacking before, but his credibility on that has gone way up now. People see it for the reasons they see it, and they didn't before.
I'll read a few of the specific donations. So Jack Dorsey giving $21 million to OpenSats through his charity Start Small. So this was essentially money that was delegated to a body to give out grants to open source developers. He also donated $5 million to Brink, which is a Bitcoin development organization. He donated $1 million to Coin Center and also co-founded B-Trust with Jay-Z. So this is an effort to get inner city kids and developed world kids into Bitcoin coding. So his money going in this way directly to these kind of nonprofit organizations. Of course, we know that Michael Saylor has dabbled in nonprofit organizations. There was, of course, his famous mining council, so sort of setting up a group of miners to deal with energy usage in the industry, one of his less popular forays, but also very interested in the political elements as well, has donated to the Bitcoin Policy Institute, as well as other think tanks and nonprofits pushing forward Bitcoin and crypto on the regulatory side. So, maybe with Michael Saylor here, it's not that he's not active in these same areas as Jack. It's just there's a bit of a different flavor. Michael, Nolan, your thoughts?
I think at the end of the day, these investments in open source developers, I think it's really important because you're essentially investing in the next generation of shepherds for the Bitcoin network. And whether you agree with a more conservative developmental cycle, which personally I do, or you feel that that development layer should be more aggressive in looking for ways for the network to be more efficient, ways to squash bugs more effectively. At the end of the day, I mean, if you think about it, the generation of developers who were there in the early days of Bitcoin, they're not going to be around forever. And if this network is going to go on for several centuries, as it is designed to do, you do need to continuously invest in that next generation. So I think there is a lot of wisdom in doing that. Now, obviously, perhaps the profit motive isn't as readily apparent as, say, investing in a mining company or investing in something that is going to make money. But I do think it's important work, and I think the debate over whether or not those who are major stakeholders in the ecosystem and those who have benefited greatly from what has essentially been either free or underpaid, or in some areas well compensated development work. I do think that those debates are important, and I think that there is a lot of merit to those who argue that those to whom the network has been kind should return that kind of energy. But again, I think again in both Saylor's case as well, they've invested in lobbying efforts and those regulatory efforts. Those are equally important. They have continued the conversation of education, which has been going on for the better part of a decade. So it's not to minimize that, but I would say that those who think that the development will take care of itself, maybe that seems like the case now, but I would caution against becoming too myopic about what's actually happening beneath the surface. Obviously, when there's a big debate over, should we make this change? Should the miners be engaging in this certain behavior? There have been 1,000 debates like that over the history of Bitcoin. But what has been constant is the little unseen work to keep the network from falling apart. And at the end of the day, if the network can't function, then what's the point?
Well, I would say Michael Saylor has jumped into that in a different way, but in a way that I think all three of us would recognize because we've been in events and we understand the importance of public spaces and third spaces in the industry and what these events actually do for, I mean, we saw core at all of our events that we produced over the years, right? We saw what happened with the New York agreement. What we see happening right now with MicroStrategy's office is they actually turned it into one of these studios. I mean, they held the OpNext event there a few weeks ago, hosted by Blockspace Media. This was just before the BTC++ event where all these Fix the Filters debates happened. He's turning Strategy itself into like a studio space so that Bitcoiners can go and have these debates. So he's really creating like a curated media environment so that people can have these conversations. And I think in some ways not being involved in picking winners, and his position being Michael Saylor, if he starts anointing people in the same way that we saw Jack Dorsey do, it could have an outsized effect. Just look at what he did with Luke Dash Jr. and the ocean mining thing. Luke has been on about this stuff for 12, 15, forever, making the same
it does
point.
seem like Jack might have to intervene there. But turning the page from development over to the Treasury side, so kind of flipping the switch on two ways to look at these giants, Jack Dorsey and Michael Saylor. On the balance sheet, MicroStrategy closing in on 600,000 Bitcoin, have invested at this point upwards of $62 billion, I believe is the valuation of their treasury on a cost basis of around $40 billion, investing quite heavily, getting into alternative preferential stocks, creating different stock classes in order to acquire debt and buy more Bitcoin. Block Inc., though, Jack Dorsey's primary vehicle, top 10, right? So over 88,500 Bitcoin, was one of the first to fast follow Michael Saylor in this treasury strategy all the way back in 2021, famously making a large purchase that is quite in the green today. But here, the antithesis, right? I think another example where we see Michael Saylor really taking the dominant role, but Jack, not totally absent, right? There was a really good quote from Bitcoin 2025, though, that I think speaks, to the differential, which is that when Michael Saylor started buying Bitcoin, his company was a fraction of the size of Block. Today, it's close to 20 or even 50 times larger in terms of market cap. And all Michael Saylor did was put Bitcoin on the balance sheet, whereas Jack Dorsey, as we know, with Block, has the Square terminals, which has about 5 million merchants signed up, has the popular Cash App, and is a profitable business. So taking into the treasuries, Michael, Nolan, your thoughts here on this differential? Jack not out of the race, but clearly not prioritizing.
Well, so I would add one big component to how I would filter this information, how I do filter this information. It's that something like, I think the Wall Street Journal said this week, something like 60 major companies are thinking about following Michael Saylor now. The leadership that we've seen from Michael Saylor, he even mentioned his investments in the mining group. The mining group more or less turned into the Trump lobby because that's exactly how Trump was accessed originally, was through the coordination of the miners to say, hey, and these guys were facing existential crisis because of the Joe Biden war on the industry. So they had no choice but to go all in with Trump. And they were already all there because we already had the Michael Saylor thing. But go back to the companies and the leadership and everything we heard about Michael Saylor helping people get through what is essentially an existential crisis for the fiat system, the dollar, the markets, all the things that he's worried about, all the things other treasury risk managers are worried about. They see the bond auctions this week. No one showed up again. We're masturbating with the markets. We're buying our own debt again. No one's interested. And you start to see what the Iron Bank is. You had Max Kaiser talking about what he's actually building, how powerful MicroStrategy is getting. Then turn the page and find out that Jack Dorsey, in the lead up to the 2024 election, is out on Noster simping to people about Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 11.9 and the Russia collusion shit. So just look at the leadership here, and it bothered me a lot because we can't forget what he used to have, Jack Dorsey. He founded Twitter. And now I defended him for years publicly. He's a Bitcoiner. I spent years saying, he didn't know about the censorship. Usually in every company, the CEO is sort of out of touch. We've all seen out of touch CEOs in our time in the places we've worked, right? It's typical for a CEO to be out of touch. The job of a lot of people around a CEO is to keep them in the dark about what's going on in their own company, because that's just the nature of human beings. Meanwhile, Jack Dorsey is out there pushing what everyone knows is fake news, right? He was a big RFK fan, and then he didn't like where that went. So now RFK, you're simping for government if you like Maha. He abandoned all of that stuff. And then the leadership, who's actually following Jack Dorsey? Nobody. The answer is no one. And when he did the Michael Moore thing, that made a liar out of people like me, because I defended him until I saw that, until the days before the election when he's out there spreading absolute trash nonsense. That's actually just spreading mental illness to the people that simp for him on Nostr. And there's no empowerment there. There's no trying to get anyone out of a hole. He can talk all he wants about educating people with Jay-Z. Where did that all go?
I was taking counterpoint with this. I don't think we can call Jack entirely a hypocrite, right? I think if you look at what he's doing with the African Bitcoin conference, both in helping to fund it and put this on, I think it's very clear that he's uncomfortable with the sort of America First Bitcoin movement. He's uncomfortable with the overt politicization of Bitcoin, that Michael Saylor has leaned into a lot more heavily. But I would say that, he's been pretty strong in blazing his own path and seeing Bitcoin as something for the world, right? Something that's outside these political systems. I famously, sort of said on this podcast when, we streamed the White House summit that Jack Dorsey wasn't there, right? Michael Saylor was in the room cracking jokes with Donald Trump. Jack Dorsey wasn't there, and I think that sent a signal. But I think, we see someone who's maybe unwilling to get politically involved. I personally think that's a good thing. Whereas with Michael Saylor,
I agree with you. But spreading Russia collusion in 2024 is getting personally involved. Think about what you're doing to your fans. People listen to him and admire him, and I understand why. There's a lot to admire. I did. I defended him for years. I wouldn't let any MAGA person insult Jack Dorsey. I said, come on. Who would know who's censoring who with the thing? They lied to him. He didn't know. He was out of the loop. But if you're out there causing mental illness, you're out there spreading absolute hallucinations, then it's another story. You can love Africa and be anti-America first all you want. That doesn't bother me as much as spreading mental illness. And I don't see Michael Saylor spreading mental illness.
Migrated heavily into politics from the corporate treasury side. Maybe you can take us back at what the connecting dots are here.
Well, the corporate treasury side is important because we're dealing with the failure of the American empire. We're dealing with the failure and the end of whatever it was we understood America to be all these years. And the US dollar being intrinsically part of that, Michael Saylor is helping mitigate or bridge the gap between what we don't like about America that's dying and what we want to preserve and maybe keep with us into the future. America's not all bad, obviously.
Do you see him more aligned with something like the BitBond proposal that's kind of coming out of Michael Saylor's work?
Yes, exactly. The whole BitBond idea. And look, you can hate Donald Trump all you want, but there's change afoot. It's beyond MAGA. It's beyond Republican politics. It's all around America. It's all around our role in the world. I got no problem. Go to Africa, support the event. I love that's all great, right? But why are you causing Americans to go down the wrong path? That's a problem. And Michael Saylor is not out there doing that. He's out there telling you the truth as far as he's telling you. He doesn't mean if he's right? That's what it comes down to. I don't think Jack Dorsey believes Michael Moore's videos, okay? Because they're stupid. So there's no way he could believe it unless he's dumb, and he's not. So something else is going on here. And so my problem is just that it's the leadership thing. You've got 60 companies following Michael Saylor. You've got all kinds of Bitcoiners ready to go to war for this guy. He's telling them what he believes is the truth. The dollar is dying. We need a solution to get out of it. Jack Dorsey can say, I hope that Bitcoin becomes the main currency, but he's not telling you the truth about the US dollar. He's not out there telling you the truth about America. He's giving you his own version. If you like Joe Biden, we can survive and do both. I don't think that's true. Now, he hasn't said that. I've totally, put words in his mouth, so it's not true what he said. He's never been out there saying that. But by going out and spreading these kinds of lies, by sowing more division, these are things he didn't need to do. And I took them personally. So just because it made me a liar, I defended him for years, and I don't like that. I usually get this stuff right. And to get it so wrong with Jack Dorsey, to me, is I won't look at him the same after that. I just can't. He made me a liar or wrong or whatever.
Let's take a quick break to talk about today's sponsor, Ledn, the most trusted name in Bitcoin-backed lending. Look, if you're like me, you never really want to think about selling your Bitcoin. Ledn has a solution. You can borrow against your Bitcoin. No credit checks, no monthly payments, no hidden fees. You can get your cash in under 12 hours and pay back when you want with zero penalties. Unlike other platforms, Ledn has a history of transparency. They prove it with independent proof of reserves audits every 6 months on the blockchain. In total, they've issued more than $9 billion in loans without losing a single satoshi of client funds. That's the kind of track record you want when it comes to securing your Bitcoin. You can learn more. Visit ledn.io. That's ledn.io. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research. Well, if you're counting the money, 700,000 Bitcoin now amassed by these treasuries, just to kind of footnote what Nolan was saying, there's actually over 200 companies following the Michael Saylor playbook now. But to be fair, it's become a bit of a religion, right, Michael? This idea that, Michael Saylor will show up to these events, becomes kind of a circus. And we don't know where the Bitcoin treasury model is going to go. It's a nice thought to think that businesses that buy Bitcoin will be successful, just like the individuals that did. But there's a lot of questions about this treasury model that are still unvalidated, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the world of Bitcoin has always been enamored with cults of personality. Not to suggest that Michael Saylor sits at the center of a cult intentionally, but I do think that are people looking at him as another coming of some like a Satoshi level figure? I'd say like that's perhaps fair. I don't think through any necessarily fault of Saylor himself. I mean, in terms of where this treasury strategy goes, I think it's an open question. When you see comments out there in the ether of, well, this is an infallible model, it can go on forever. I mean, this line has been said across the Bitcoin and crypto space again and again and again.
Michael Saylor saying that
every cycle.
Yeah, every cycle we have something like this. Now, is that to suggest that these treasuries are going to implode one day? Like, I'm not saying that. I'm not sophisticated enough. But, I see a few things going on here. I see that there is a level of financial engineering here that is genuinely interesting. I think there is a lot of evangelizing and narrative building happening around that. And I think that narrative building is where you create some level of risk and potential vectors for attack. I mean, at the end of the day, these are people who are selling a story, and like Wall Street has been selling stories for as long as Wall Street has existed. So when I hear, oh, well, this is about the democratization of money and the replacement of the dollar, like that could very well be true. But I also am very aware that I am being like told a story in order to perhaps induce me to purchase something, which again is just what Wall Street does. I think, a number of years ago, a kind of collective decision was made to tilt the industry in the direction of Wall Street and financial types, like perhaps more than it was like earlier in its history. And I think that, will there one day be a kind of reckoning for that? I don't know. But I do think that choice was made. And I think that the corporate treasury strategy is at this point in time the ultimate reflection of that sort of quasi group decision to say, well, we've been trying to do payments for many, many years. It hasn't really caught on. Like there isn't a ton of adoption here, but this store of value, like what are the manifestations of this? And I think what's happening now, it's genuinely very interesting. And I think you're seeing a lot of companies look at this to see a way to potentially engage investors with their stock. And again, like by buying Bitcoin, it gives them something to tell and a story to sell that they haven't really been able to. I mean, think about GameStop. I think GameStop is a perfect example of this where like, what's the reason to buy GameStop stock? Like if you've been to a GameStop recently, they're not very nice stores. You don't really need to go to them unless you're trying to buy like nerdy merch. Otherwise, their selections kind of suck. You can just buy these games online. But by having a Bitcoin treasury strategy, there is now a new reason to be interested in GameStop, which ultimately has nothing to do with their core business model. Again, I'm not trying to cast like a moral aspersion on this, but just to say like what is happening at like a behavioral level and to acknowledge that this is kind of a thing. So is it sustainable in the long run? I think I've been around crypto to say long enough that I don't know for sure if all of these companies are like quote unquote going to make it and whether this strategy will help them achieve the objectives they want. But when you see a lot of people running into the same room, all chasing the same idea, which again, ultimately is to give them something new to tell to their investors, I think it should perhaps be a cause to pause and say, like, what are we trying to do here? Is there a gap between what's actually happening on the ground and like the gap happening in the narrative? And I think that the Bitcoin/crypto space has always been very susceptible to either comforting or thesis affirming narratives. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that to whatever aim there might be. And maybe I'm wrong about this, but
no. So I'd say you're right about, I agree with you about almost everything except the one point you said about a conscious decision was made to steer towards Wall Street. There was a bunch of little conscious decisions, but I don't think anyone in a room said we're going to go to Wall Street now.
I totally agree. I don't think it was like we had a Bitcoin Congress and decided we're going to vote to go to Wall Street, but I think that there were a lot of incentives on the table. And I think everyone sort of, like, that's why I said like quasi-group collective decision. Let's sort of all move in this direction where there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of money. And again, I think a new kind of, I hate to use the word paradigm, but it kind of fits here, like a new paradigm for creating a narrative after, I would say, like the better part of a decade of different sort of crypto narratives that kind of came and went, to be honest. I mean, think about it. 10 years ago, we were talking about Bitcoin as a means to tip people on the internet. Super cool, a lot of fun, but was it the catalyst engine?
It's still happening on Nostr.
Yeah. So what I will say, though, is that, and it's part of where the decision, because it's the psychology and the narrative part, but where that fits in is and it's a predictive model that I've used a lot, and I think I've probably mentioned on this show before. It's just the human capital as it comes into the industry. What I view is when someone leaves their established profession and joins Bitcoin, that's giving you an indication of where the narrative is at, because people have to sort of talk themselves into leaving their industry. Cryptographers were the first, right? They got the first access. That's where this stuff all came from. Then I would say the political people were kind of next, right? The Ron Paul 2012 campaign, refugees. We started to see the political thing get in. Wall Street people came next because the miners needed treasury management. They needed risk management. They were sick of selling the bottom. They were sick of not being able to manage their Bitcoin flows. And they started hiring all of these risk managers and Wall Street people. That's why we made a conscious decision at CoinDesk to cover the Wall Street angle. And it was because we saw people leaving jobs and they were going into this thing and they needed information and they were coming to CoinDesk. So, that Michael Saylor is there because people are realizing in their own companies, professional people who manage treasury and corporations are seeing it's not working. And so they're moving there. So whenever they need a bit of encouragement when you're leaving behind a whole world in order to go in this thing, you've got to kind of give yourself a story to tell to do it. And companies are doing the same as people. When they're going to reskin themselves as Bitcoiners from fiat companies, they got to be able to believe in it. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And that's kind of, when you hear Michael Saylor, remember the Hope campaign, right? Bitcoin is hope. He had the hope.com. He'd been sitting on hope.com as a website for 30 years or something like that. And so suddenly he dusted it off. He was hoping to speculate and sell that website, right? And finally he realized he could do something himself with it. And that hope.com is the narrative. So he is absolutely selling the narrative. The narrative is everything. These are psychological commodities. Bitcoin is a psychological commodity. And the psychology that is brought to it is why it's strong. Now, I'll go back and say the same thing. We knew we had to make a move into politics because of what happened with the last administration. We understood immediately at Bitcoin 2022, for example, we lost all the celebrities because of the ETHMAC stuff. And Kim Kardashian and Floyd Mayweather, and then the actions, and then all the trouble. And then suddenly there was no way we were getting Aaron Rodgers to come to our event anymore. There was no way we were getting Odell Beckham Jr. to come speak at our event. So what did we do? We went for the B-level celebrities, the politicians, and we had no choice. We had to drive it fully. And it was not Democrat or Republican. If you remember, in 2023, the big pivot was to RFK, who was trying to run for president as a Democrat. This was not political. But then go back and see, you got Michael Saylor injecting all this stuff. What did we get? We got Mike Brock, mentally ill Mike Brock, coming around telling us that if we're not going to sponsor your event if you're an alt-right event. We had RFK before, when he was a Democrat, and it wasn't good enough for them. If you remember, they went and did some event out on some random street where you couldn't even use their wallet. It was a big fiasco, big failure. And they tried to actually steer our company, our sponsorships and all that. They a kind of blackmail to say, we're not going to give you anything if you don't do it our way. We don't like Bukele. We don't like these people. And so what does that say about what they're doing? I mean, you have people that need the story and they're literally circumventing people from getting the story. And I gave Mike Brock a bunch of chances. I went on stage with him. I talked with him. There's no appeal to this guy. He's got problems, right? He's got some problems. And he's out there spreading this nonsense. Is Michael Saylor putting anyone out in the market that's got these problems? I don't see that, right?
I do think the conditions for sort of like I don't want to call it like the financialization of Bitcoin. I feel like those were a lot earlier, right? I mean, I'm sure Pete will appreciate. I'm gonna name drop Mercer Popescu on this podcast.
We love Mercer. We're Mercer's in the
back
game.
To MPEX. I mean, MPEX was essentially a stock exchange back in like 2011, I think it was founded. Crypto stocks was really, I mean, the whole sort of like visual framework for how to exchange like digital assets. I mean, it looked like a stock exchange. So I feel like a lot of these components were there, but just sort of the nature of the narratives that were emerging and rising and falling. Like I think at some point in like the late 2010s, early 2020s began, I think, an undeniable shift toward like, well, no, like this isn't just sort of a means to the end. Like this is the end. And I think it's interesting, like when you go back to that early Bitcoin talk post by Satoshi about like the scale of miners, right? Like from like little mom and pop shops to like industrial scale stuff. I think that like the financialized side of Bitcoin went through a similar evolution where it was, you went from your Floridian based scam exchanges to, we're talking about what BlackRock is doing, where they're offering these like, these huge things for their clients. So, it's very interesting, but do I wonder where it's all going to end and like, will it ultimately be a positive end? I'm not sure. Tough to say.
Well, so we talked about the development. We talked about their treasuries, two issues on which Jack Dorsey and Michael Saylor are divergent. Finally, I wanted to bring us up to what they're up against, right? Both of these men have big ambitions, big goals for Bitcoin. In Jack's case, he wants it to be the world currency. He wants it to help bring the developed market and the developed world into the global economy of the 21st century. In Michael Saylor's case, wanting Wall Street, right, the corporate stock market to adopt Bitcoin for Treasury, basically, co-opt and go into the belly of the beast and emerge unscathed. So, what are the stakes? What are they up against? Maybe we can turn it over to Nolan. Michael, your thoughts on who is opposing each of these great Bitcoin figures?
I would kind of go back to something that Nolan said that I think is very, 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 very true, is that like, the Bitcoin, digital currencies, they're psychological assets. And so ultimately, like what they are up against is the psychology of humans. Like right now, I think like that psychology is very risk on. People are looking at Bitcoin as something in this moment in history. Maybe it's a way to move money around the world in a way they couldn't. Maybe it's a way to retain or grow value in a way they couldn't. And I think what's gone on the last 15, almost 20 years, at least since the great financial panic, is the collective realization that there are haves and there are have-nots. And I think like Bitcoin succeeded in the way that it has since its inception because it was a pipe to kind of take a third path where like it really was like sort of like a Wild West digital frontier where you could make something of your own. And looking in the months and years ahead, it's going to be that continued psychology. Like, will that kind of support continue to exist? Will there be events that shake that? Will there be political decisions here in the U.S. that shake that? Political decisions abroad, economic decisions. I mean, I know people in coin land love Trump. I don't necessarily agree with all the things that they feel, but like, are there decisions or consequences that could emerge from the Trump-led government that like shifts a position on this stuff? Like, absolutely. So ultimately, it all really boils down to that psychological state, whether it continues to be conducive for Bitcoin. And I think that will impact the work that either Jack Dorsey is doing or that Michael Saylor is doing. If I had to like throw a dart at the wall, I would say that probably the work that Michael Saylor is doing is probably more susceptible to that psychology because it is attached to like a freely traded and like volatile market. Whereas on the Dorsey side, like it is, I think it's slower, and because it is sort of bound to like building infrastructure and investing in events and investing in coding and development, I think it isn't so subject to the forces of volatility, but that's not to suggest that they are immune to their own challenges. So yeah, I would say like that.
I would say take the counter of that. I think Jack Dorsey has some big opponents to his vision. One is that he wants to decentralize mining, right? He's essentially pointed out the largest centralization vector in Bitcoin currently is mining centralization. This idea that most of the chips that go into most of the rigs that are bought by Bitcoin data centers are essentially produced by one of two companies. So that's either China-based Bitmain or WhatsMiner, who are the big chip providers at this point, and has sort of put a ton of his capital and now 3 years of effort into building his own mining chip. So on the mining decentralization front, really I think Jack is up against the largest chip manufacturer in the world, like TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor group that prints and puts out these chips, right? So he is really kind of putting a ton of capital into fixing one he sees as one of the largest, longest standing issues in the Bitcoin world, which I find pretty fascinating. And then on the Michael Saylor side, I would say, less of a technology, but his bets also require a similar change to a similar superstructure, right? He is trying to convince S&P 500 businesses. He's trying to convince your Microsofts, your Facebooks. We saw this with Meta at the Bitcoin conference, right? That they should hold Bitcoin on the balance sheet, right? So essentially trying to turn corporate boardrooms and kind of face headwinds there. But yeah, I think they're both, in terms of antagonists, Michael Saylor definitely more on the Wall Street side, maybe has more political antagonists, right? There are kind of groups on the political left that would love to see Michael Saylor pushed out and shut out. Two different types of foes and forces there. Your take, Nolan?
The way I think about it is, like you said, narrative, who are the enemies? You have to have these narratives and psychological commodities. The good news that we have, and everything I've said about Jack Dorsey and all that, is that even in subject matter that's contentious that we argue about, one of the neat things about Nakamoto consensus as it pertains to even the network functioning also applies to Bitcoiners. We can move forward if we don't agree on things. Bitcoiners have proven that time and time again. We can show division at a scale and a threshold, the fault tolerance of Nakamoto consensus being 51 to 49. We don't need a unified narrative in order to move forward. We can move forward as discordant people as long as we agree about a few essential things to Bitcoin, and that's about it. Now, one of the weird things about World War II consensus, the sort of consensus model, the storytelling model that we've used until now as Americans or global people, is everything in World War II was good versus evil, and you had to see it that way. And what we've seen from, for example, what Kanye did or Ye did recently, the World War II consensus it's not working. No one wants to see the world that way anymore. You can't see it in such contrasting, black and white. And you start to understand a bit about what made red and blue and the uniparty and the kind of fake debates that still tucked into a type of World War II consensus. That's breaking apart. The people that established the World War II consensus are dying, and the people that are inheriting the world don't want to function on that narrative anymore. And one of the weird things that you see as the World War II consensus is slipping is mainstream media. If you think about it, if you read the Fiat Standard, for example, when Saifedean turned the language of fiat into Bitcoin readable terms, right? The nodes and the network and how the network perpetuates. What's the fault tolerance of the World War II consensus? I mean, if 20% of people ask what happened to Jack Kennedy, what happens to the World War II consensus? We see it. The fault tolerance is very, very low. It can't handle it. It has to start going in overdrive. Did you see what happened in LA? You have to agree with me. You have to see it my way. And you start to see why the machine is skipping and why the fault tolerance can't accept anything else. So the good news about where we're at with both Jack Dorsey and Michael Saylor is that they can have completely different visions about where Bitcoin has to head next. And it kind of doesn't matter. We're still going to be able to move forward. They don't even have to be friends. But the good news about Bitcoin is we all end up, even though we hate each other, getting along just fine. even if it is a 49 to 51%. So I fundamentally believe that that's a great gift we have to offer the world right now. I know when I got into Bitcoin, hanging out with all you guys, it was not easy in the normie world to be a 2015 MAGA, long Trump, long Bitcoin guy. But in Bitcoin in New York, no one gave a shit. No one was like, oh, you like Trump? No one cared. We were fine in Bitcoin. We were all okay with it. As long as you like Bitcoin, you kind of got the benefit of the doubt. Everyone let you be. No one had a problem. No one was crazy insulted by it. I remember talking with Michael McSweeney about this on the rooftop all those years ago, and he couldn't believe the way they were trying to tar and feather Trump at the time. And he's definitely not a Trump fan. And even then he knew Trump fans are not the devil, and Bitcoin had an understanding of this beyond most people.
Bitcoin, the great uniter, and perhaps both of them will end up succeeding in the long run. Final thoughts, Jack Dorsey versus Michael Saylor. It sounds like there's no competition here. Is that the verdict, Nolan?
Yeah, I just look at the time in history that we're at, and I look at the fiat apocalypse in front of us, and hearing Michael Saylor talk to Jordan Peterson about the Canadian truckers and what that meant, and having to contemplate the government seizing your assets. Remember, that was like pipe dreams to us when we were just getting, it might mean something to someone in Africa, but we got the problems here. We got censored during Joe Biden's time. We were treated way worse as Bitcoiners in America than the Canadian truckers situation was. It was awful. So it's not about America or Canada. America had just as much capacity to be terrible as anything else. But this is what this era, epochal change looks like. And I think at this point, when we look at leadership, it looks like capital markets have to go first. It looks like the Bitcoin standard is the first thing on the docket. I remember years ago, Jesse Powell saying that we would like to do both the privacy thing and the technical thing along with the macroeconomics at the same time. It was his opinion, and I've seen it repeated by many people since, that you got to do these in stages. It looks like the economic thing is first. If we win the Bitcoin standard from an economic point of view and we cut the funding to the fiat propagation machine, then we got a real chance at reinstilling privacy next. And that's where a lot of what Jack Dorsey's working on will probably likely have the opportunity to grow and flourish. I see it as a step order change, that we're entering a type of bimetallism, a halfway house where Bitcoin exists, where dollars exist. And privacy is, because I don't value my privacy, I'll be honest with you. I'll trade it for anything people offer me on the internet, not because that's what you end up doing. You just don't. I've done it so many times. I absolutely don't care. You have to get into the subconscious of people, to their consumption, to their lizard brain. We got to reprogram people from the base level of money, and we're not quite there yet. If we separate money and state, change the way we think about consumption, we got a real chance at what Jack Dorsey's building and talking about. But we got to do this capital markets thing first, as far as I can tell.
Said another way, we've got Block, we've got Strategy. Is there a company right now that is better for Bitcoin, or that you think is a better bet on the future of where Bitcoin is going? Michael, Nolan?
I like Metaplanet just because Japan, I've always believed Satoshi Nakamoto was, and they're doing it differently. You're
choosing Strategy because my Metaplanet is essentially a copycat. You're saying
not exactly. No, not exactly. They're doing things differently. I've in fact had the privilege of hearing from Dylan, Michael Saylor, tell him he's an idiot and that everything he's doing is stupid.
Tough to say if there's sort of like a third dark horse out there, but I would be willing to bet that somewhere there is a young developer, maybe they're working on Core right now, who has the next big idea. And so I think that we just kind of have to wait and see.
Maybe we'll be funded by Jack Dorsey. Thanks for the thoughts. So we've got Michael McSweeney from The Block here, and Nolan Bauerle from Bitcoin on Rumble. This has been a Supply Shock podcast. You're watching blockworks.co.